There's a sound that the city makes after midnight that most people never hear. Not the sirens, not the traffic, not the drunk laughter spilling out of bars on Meridian Avenue. Those are the sounds of people who are still awake on purpose, still choosing to be out in the world. I'm talking about a different sound. The sound underneath all of that. The hum. The low, almost subsonic vibration that comes up through the soles of your shoes when you're standing on pavement at 2:13 in the morning and there is almost nobody left alive in the street. A hum that feels less like the city and more like the city breathing. Like it's still awake even though it's pretending to sleep. I know that sound very well. My name is Nora Vasquez, and I have worked the late shift at the Halcyon Research Annex for 4 years, 7 months. And as of the night this story begins, approximately 9 days. I know the exact number because I started counting after the incident with the broken elevator in March. I figured if I was going to be the last living soul in a 17-story building on a regular basis, I might as well keep track of how long I'd been doing it. Like a prisoner scratching marks into a wall, except my wall was the calendar on my desktop, and my marks were the little red dot I put on each date I survived to see sunrise without anything terrible happening. 4 years, 7 months, 9 days. Nothing terrible had happened yet. But I want to be honest with you. When I say nothing terrible, what I really mean is nothing terrible that I knew about. Because something had been happening for a long, long time. I just hadn't seen it yet. The Halcyon Research Annex sits at the edge of what the city planners call the Innovation District, which is a fancy name for the section of downtown where they bulldozed all the old warehouses and put up glass and steel towers full of biotech firms and data companies, and the occasional government contractor trying very hard to look like they're not a government contractor. Halcyon is the latter, not entirely anyway. We're listed publicly as a materials science research facility, and that's true partially. We do research materials. We study properties of rare compounds, thermal tolerances, molecular bonding at non-standard pressure conditions. The work is real. I've read enough of it to understand maybe 30%, and that 30% is genuinely interesting. But there's a floor in our building, the 16th floor, that I have never been to. That most of the 200 employees at Halcyon have never been to. The elevator requires a separate keycard to reach it, and the keycard is biometric, and the list of people cleared for that biometric system numbers, by my rough estimate, fewer than 8. I'm not on that list. I'm on the 14th floor, data management and archival support. Which means I take the raw data produced by the researchers and I organize it, catalog it, tag it, package it for long-term storage and retrieval. It is not glamorous work, but it is precise work, and I am a precise person, and the pay is good enough that I stopped applying to other jobs sometime around year 2. The late shift exists because data doesn't wait for business hours. When the research teams run experiments that generate massive output, particle analysis, spectral mapping, whatever they're doing up on 16 that nobody talks about, the data comes streaming into the servers at all hours, and someone has to process it. That someone is usually me. Not always. There's a rotating team of 5 of us who split the late shifts. But I take more than my share because I genuinely don't mind. My apartment is small and quiet and full of plants that I'm mostly keeping alive, and I have been single for 2 years. And the honest truth is that the Halcyon building at midnight is sometimes more comforting than going home. At least here I feel useful. The night it started was a Tuesday in November. I know it was Tuesday because we had an all-hands meeting that afternoon, which only happens on Tuesdays, and I had spent most of it trying not to fall asleep, while Dr. Callum Reyes explained a new data compression protocol that was, in his own words, revolutionary, and was, in my words, a slightly better way to zip files. The meeting ended at 5. I went to the break room, made a double espresso from the machine on the counter, ate a granola bar that had expired 3 weeks ago, and then went back to my desk and waited for the night team to filter out. By 8, the floor was mostly empty. By 10, it was completely empty except for me and the cleaning crew who came through at 10:30, said hello, vacuumed around my chair without asking me to move, and left by 11. At 11:15, the first data package from the research lab came through. It was big, bigger than usual. The file header said it was spectral imaging data, which is normal, but the volume was roughly 4 times the standard output, and the metadata tags were formatted in a way I hadn't seen before. New protocol, maybe, or something had changed upstairs. I didn't question it, I just started working. Here's the thing about data management work that people on the outside don't understand. It's not mindless. People assume it's just filing, just clicking and dragging, just organizing. And yes, technically that's what it is. But when you're doing it right, when you're actually doing it well, you're also reading the data. You're learning its shape. You're understanding not just what it says, but how it's structured, why it's structured that way, what that structure implies about the experiment that generated it. Over 4 years, I have learned a lot about Halcyon's research without anyone ever explaining it to me directly. Not because I was snooping, because the data itself teaches you if you're paying attention. And I was always paying attention. So when the data package from that Tuesday night came through, and something about the spectral signatures was wrong, not wrong like corrupted, wrong like different, wrong like these readings don't match any material I've processed before, I noticed. I flagged it internally. I tagged the anomalous files separately. I made a note in the processing log that said, spectral bands in the 340-360 nm range show non-standard absorption patterns, flagging for researcher review. I sent the flag to Dr. Reyes, who was the nominal head of data review. I expected him to respond the next morning with some brief explanation about a new compound they were testing. He never responded. But something else did. I noticed the window at 12:47 a.m. 17 floors. My window faced north, which meant it looked out over the lower buildings in that direction, mostly 3- and 4-story commercial spaces, a parking structure, and beyond that the river. The view at night was mostly dark with scattered amber lights from the street lamps along the river walk. I had looked at that view probably 800 times. I knew it the way you know the wallpaper in a room you've lived in for years. It was background. It was just there. So I can't entirely explain how I noticed the difference. But I noticed it. There was something standing on the roof of the parking structure across the street. Now people stand on roofs. This happens. It's a city. People go up on roofs for all kinds of reasons. Phone calls, fresh air. The occasional reckless moment that you later describe at parties as, when I was young and stupid. But this figure was not moving. Not at all. Not even the small constant shift that human bodies make when they're standing, the slight lean, the weight transfer, the invisible micro-adjustments that keep us upright. We are never perfectly still, not when we're alive and breathing. This figure was perfectly still. It was standing at the edge of the parking structure roof, facing the Halcyon building. Facing, as far as I could tell, my window specifically. I stared at it for maybe 30 seconds, told myself it was a statue, one of those decorative pieces that architects sometimes put on buildings, a relic from an older era of the structure. Then I remembered I had looked at that parking structure 800 times, and there had never been a statue on its roof. I turned back to my work. When I looked again 2 minutes later, the figure was gone. I wrote it off. Long hours, bad lighting, tired eyes. I processed the rest of the data package, filed my logs, shut down my workstation, put on my coat, and went home. I did not think about it again until the next day, when he walked into my life and turned it into something I don't have adequate language for yet. But I'm going to try. morning light and strange visitors. I usually sleep until 10 when I work late shifts. That Wednesday I woke up at 7:45 for no reason I could identify. No alarm, no noise from the street, just awake. Suddenly and completely, which is not how I normally wake up. I'm usually a slow riser. I have a whole system. Alarm, snooze, second alarm, sit up, sit there staring at nothing for 4 minutes, eventually move. That morning I opened my eyes and I was just already there, present, alert. I lay in bed for a few minutes trying to understand why. Then I got up, made coffee, watered my plants. I have 11. A collection of succulents, 2 ferns, and a monstera named Gerald that has been with me since graduate school, and sat at my kitchen table and looked at my phone. No messages from Dr. Reyes about the flagged data. Expected. A text from my friend Priya that said, "You alive? Haven't heard from you in like 2 weeks. That's either good or bad." I replied, "Alive, mostly late shifts." "Coffee soon?" She replied immediately, "Yes, literally any time, name it." We made plans for Saturday. I finished my coffee, showered, changed into the kind of outfit I wear when I go into the office on a non-mandatory basis, jeans, a dark blue sweater, clean sneakers, and went in early. Not because I had to, because something about waking up at 7:45 without knowing why made me feel like maybe I should be places earlier than usual. It would be months before I understood that I woke up because something changed in the city while I slept. Something that my body registered on some frequency below conscious thought. Something that arrived. He was in the Halcyon lobby at 9:17. I know the time because I was at the security desk picking up a replacement access badge. Mine had started glitching on the elevator reader. And the guard, Marcus, was logging my request into the system when the front doors opened and this man walked in. I say this man like it's a normal descriptor, like I could describe anyone else who walked into the Halcyon lobby that morning in the same words. I can't, because he was not like any of the other people who walked into that lobby. He was tall, well over 6 feet, in a way that somehow managed to be unobtrusive. Dark coat, charcoal colored, long, the kind of coat that looks expensive without being showy. Dark hair, slightly long, the kind that falls forward over the forehead and makes you think either he doesn't think about it at all or he thinks about it very precisely. I couldn't tell which. His face was, look, I'm going to try to describe it accurately and I'm going to fail, but here goes. High cheekbones, sharp jaw, eyes that were a color I still can't name exactly, somewhere between gray and green depending on what light hit them and at what angle. He was pale in the way of someone who doesn't spend a lot of time outside, but not sickly, more like carved, like a thing made in shade on purpose. He walked to the front desk with the kind of deliberate, unhurried certainty that made you feel like he had done it before. Like he had been here before, except I had been working here for 4.5 years, and I had never seen him. "Good morning," he said to the receptionist, Amara, who handled the front desk. "I have a meeting with Dr. Reyes." His voice was, I'm going to just say it, the kind of voice that makes your brain do something involuntary. Low and controlled, with a precision in the consonants that suggested either a very good education or a first language that wasn't English, or maybe both. Amara typed something into her computer. "Can I get your name?" "Vane," he said, "Dorian Vane." I should not have been paying as much attention to this as I was. Marcus had asked me a question about which elevator the faulty badge was failing on, and I had answered it, and he had nodded, and somewhere in all of that I had continued to watch this stranger at the reception desk with a focus that was probably obvious to anyone looking. Nobody was looking. That's one advantage of lobbies. Everyone is absorbed in their own arrivals and departures. Dorian Vane gave his name, received a visitor badge, and turned toward the elevator bank. And for 1 second, one single, completely strange second, he looked at me. Not in the way that people look at other people when they're scanning a space. Not the ambient, unfocused sweep of a new arrival assessing the room. He looked at me the way you look at something you already know is there. Something specific, something already located. Then he turned and stepped into the elevator. The doors closed. I stood at the security desk with my new access badge in my hand and tried to remember if I had seen that man somewhere before. I had not. But the feeling remained, the particular, unsettling conviction that he had seen me somewhere before, knew me somehow, had expected to find me exactly where I was. I went upstairs and tried to work. I processed 3 routine data packages. I ate lunch at my desk. I handled a discrepancy in the archival index from October that I'd been meaning to address for 3 weeks. And at 4 in the afternoon, there was a knock at the door of my data management office. The door was always open. So a knock was both technically unnecessary and somehow more formal than walking in. It was a deliberate choice, a statement. I looked up. It was him, Dorian Vane, standing in the doorway of my small, slightly cluttered office on the 14th floor of a building he had no apparent reason to visit at this level, holding a tablet in one hand and looking at me with those unnameable eyes like he had been planning to arrive at this exact location for some time. "Nora Vasquez," he said. Not a question. I said yes. "Dr. Reyes asked me to speak with you about the flag you raised last night." The consultation. There are moments in your life, I think everyone has them, though nobody warns you they're coming, where the thing happening in front of you and the thing you feel about the thing are so different that there's this strange split second where you're outside yourself, watching. This was one of those moments. On one side of my brain, completely rational processing. Okay, someone from upstairs, probably research staff or a consultant. The flag I raised in the processing log last night generated some kind of response. This is normal institutional procedure. A person has been sent to explain what I saw in the data. Simple. On the other side of my brain, every nerve ending I owned was firing at once, and not in the way they fire when you're scared. In the way they fire when you are in the presence of something that your body recognizes before your mind does. Like a frequency match. Like a tuning fork being struck near another tuning fork. I am not typically a tuning fork kind of person. I was a data management analyst. I was extremely practical. I had a filing system that my colleague Jonah once called intimidatingly organized. I did not experience unexplained resonant frequency feelings about strangers who knocked on my office door. And yet, "Sure," I said, "come in." He came in, took the chair across the desk from me, the one that Jonah usually sat in when he came by to complain about the printer, and set his tablet on the edge of the desk and looked at me. "Tell me what you noticed," he said. Not "here's what the readings were," not "I'm here to clarify something." Tell me what you noticed. Like my observation was the point. Like he was here to learn something from me, not to explain something to me. I leaned back slightly. The spectral band data in the 340 to 360 nanometer range. Absorption patterns that don't match anything in the reference index. Non-standard, non-recurring, no analogs in any of the compound profiles I've processed over the last 4.5 years. He nodded slowly. "You've processed that kind of data for 4.5 years. 4 years, 7 months. And you know the reference index well enough to identify an anomaly at that level." "I know the reference index well enough to identify an anomaly at any level," I said. "That's the job." Something shifted in his expression. It wasn't quite a smile. It was more like the thing that happens slightly before a smile, when the idea of being amused registers but hasn't made it to the face yet. "Yes," he said, "it is." He turned the tablet around and placed it facing me. On the screen was a spectral graph, the same band range I had flagged, The same unusual absorption pattern, but shown now in a much higher resolution than my workstation had access to. The waveform was extraordinary. Sharp and complex and somehow asymmetric in a way that felt, I don't have a better word for this, intentional. Like it had structure that went beyond material properties. Like it was encoding something. "What do you see?" he asked. I studied it for a moment. "It's not a natural waveform," I said. "Natural spectral profiles in this range are relatively smooth. This has periodicity, almost like a signal." "Like a signal," he repeated. "Or an artifact, something in the sensor itself maybe, interference from." "It's not an artifact," he said quietly. "It's not instrument error, what else?" I looked at the waveform again, studied the peaks and the valleys. The way certain sections seemed to mirror each other with a symmetry that was too precise for organic materials. "There's a pattern," I said slowly, "repeating, every 47 units across the frequency spectrum. That's too regular for noise." He was very still. Not the stillness of someone thinking, the stillness of someone who already knows the answer and is watching you arrive at it. "You're the first data analyst in this building who has ever identified that," he said. "The first in 4.5 years. In 11 years that I've been associated with this research program. Yes." I looked at him for a moment. "What is it?" I said. "What's creating that pattern?" He looked at me for a long time before answering, long enough that it became the kind of pause that has weight to it. The kind that means the answer isn't simple, or isn't easy, or isn't something that gets said in data management offices in the middle of a Wednesday afternoon. "That," he said finally, "is what I've spent a very long time trying to answer." He stood, retrieved his tablet. At the door he paused. "Would you be willing to come to the 16th floor? Tonight. There are things it would be useful for you to see." I should have said I'd think about it. I should have said I'd check with Dr. Reyes. I should have done any number of sensible, professional things. Instead I said, "What time?" "9, he said. "Bring your processing logs from the last 8 months." Then he was gone, and I was alone in my office trying to remember how to breathe normally. "What lives on the 16th floor?" I called Priya at 6. "So a man came to my office today," I said. She said, "Tell me everything, start at the shoes." I told her. Not everything. I didn't know how to explain the spectral data in a way that would mean anything without 30 minutes of context building. But I told her about seeing him in the lobby, the way he said my name, the meeting, the invitation to the 16th floor. Priya was quiet for a moment after I finished. "Nora," she said. "Yeah. Is he human?" "Priya." "I'm serious. You described him like he works for the research division. He's a consultant or something." "What's his name again?" "Dorian Vane." "I'm Googling that." "Priya." Hold on, a pause. "Okay, there are approximately 0 results for Dorian Vane. None. Like nobody. He might use a different name professionally. Lots of researchers in this field use variations." "Or," she said, "he is a mysterious and possibly supernatural entity who has entered your life and invited you to a secret floor in your building at night." "He's a consultant." "Nora, you work in a building with a floor nobody is allowed on. A man nobody can Google appeared in your lobby, knew your name, and invited you to that forbidden floor. And you saw something weird on the roof last night." I had not told her about the figure on the roof. "I didn't say weird," I said. "You said perfectly still." "That's weird." "How did you? I didn't say that." "You described someone standing on a roof not moving at all at midnight. I inferred the rest." She paused. "Nora, please be careful." "I'm going," I said. "I know you are," she said, and her voice was the voice she uses when she knows arguing is pointless. "Text me. Every hour. If you stop texting, I'm calling the police." The police would have a field day with whatever is on the 16th floor. That's not reassuring. I know, I'll text you. I arrived at the 16th floor at 9:04. The elevator required the temporary access credential that had appeared in my system inbox at 8:30, sent from an internal address I didn't recognize. No email signature. Just the credential code and the number 16. The elevator opened onto a corridor that was different, not dramatically, not in the way of science fiction films where the forbidden zone is full of blinking lights and ominous machinery and someone's definitely doing something they shouldn't be. It was quieter than the other floors, actually. Softer lit. The carpet was a darker color. The ceiling was higher, or felt higher, though I couldn't explain why. The corridor ended in a large room. And the room was full of the future. I realize that sounds like something someone says in a dramatic speech, but it's actually the most accurate description I can offer. The technology in that room, the equipment along the walls, the central work surfaces, the screens showing data I had processed for 4.5 years but never seen displayed this way. It was not present-day technology. It was not the kind of thing that exists in a commercial research facility in November in a mid-size American city. It was the kind of thing that exists 10 years from now, 15, maybe more. Multispectral imaging arrays that were processing real-time atmospheric data, not local atmospheric data. The bands of information were too wide, too varied. Quantum state sensors arranged in configurations I'd never seen in any literature, academic or otherwise. A central processing core that was not running on conventional silicon. I could tell that from the way it was cooled, which was not through conventional thermal dissipation, but through something I had no name for, something that made the air around it feel slightly thicker. And walls of glass, floor to ceiling on the north face, looking out over the city. The same view I had from 14, but higher. Further. From up here you could see the river bending, the lights of the eastern suburbs, the dark space beyond where the city ended and the countryside began. Dorian Vane was standing at those windows. His back was to me. "You're 4 minutes late," he said. "The elevator is slow." I know, I had it calibrated to give me warning when it departs each floor. He turned. "Would you like to see why you're here?" "Yes," I said. "Good." He moved toward the central work surface, and I followed, and he opened a file on the primary screen, and I looked at it. And then I kept looking because what was on that screen was not the kind of thing you look at once and then look away. It was the spectral waveform I had flagged. My data. But it was overlaid with something else, a second waveform, older, in a different color, that tracked the first one with the precision of a shadow. The older waveform predated my data by, the timestamp said decades. The dates went back far enough that I did a double take and recounted. "These readings are from 1962, I said. "Yes." "And they match the anomaly from last night." "Precisely, same absorption profile. Same 47-unit periodicity, same non-standard bands." "That's 64 years of data." "Longer than that," he said. "Those are just the records we've digitized. The pre-digital records go back to 1887. I looked up from the screen. "What is it?" I asked again. "And this time please actually tell me." He was quiet for a moment, standing there with those gray-green eyes and that face that was too still, too controlled, too everything. And then he said something that I thought I hadn't heard correctly the first time, that I made him repeat, and when he repeated it and I still didn't argue with it, I think that was the moment where some part of me accepted that the world was different than I had believed it to be. He said, "It's a curse signal. Spectral resonance emitted by a specific biological entity that has been confined to a geographic radius of approximately 3.7 miles from this building for 139 years. He paused. "And I am that entity. The curse of Dorian Vane. I want to be clear about my reaction, because I think it matters. I did not laugh. I did not back away. I did not say that's ridiculous or I'm leaving or any of the other reasonable things a person might say upon being told that the man standing in front of them is a century-and-a-half old cursed biological entity. What I did was, I sat down in the nearest chair, I set my bag down, I folded my hands on the work surface, and I said, "Okay, start from the beginning." I think this response surprised him. I think from the slight shift in his expression, not quite human, too controlled, the emotions moving under the surface like something under ice, he had been prepared for more resistance. "You believe me," he said. "I believe the data," I said. "The data is showing me something real. You're claiming to be the source of that something. I want to understand the mechanism. So, start from the beginning." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he sat down across the work surface from me, and he started from the beginning. His name in full was Dorian Aldrich Vane. He was born in 1748, in a city on the eastern coast of a country that no longer exists under its original name, in a house that had been in his family for generations. He was the third son of a minor aristocracy, not king, not noble in the grand sense, but old money, old name, old influence in the way that the 17th and 18th century European gentry had influence. Which was to say, everyone who mattered in his world knew who he was, and he moved through that world with the particular ease of a person who has never had to fight to be recognized. He was also, by the time he was 23, extremely talented, not just educated, genuinely gifted, mathematically and scientifically, in an era when those disciplines were beginning to separate from natural philosophy and become something recognizable as modern science. He had correspondence with half a dozen people who would end up in history books. He was working on a theory of electromagnetic resonance almost 100 years before the concept existed in formal scientific vocabulary. "You know it as electromagnetic resonance," he said. "What I was trying to understand in 1771 was a phenomenon I called field memory, the idea that matter retains traces of its previous states in ways that can be measured and theoretically accessed." I stopped. That's actually remarkably close to some of the quantum state research being done right now. "I know, I've been watching it for 2 centuries. He said it with no drama, like a person saying they've been following a sports team for a long time. In 1773, he went looking for something that would validate his theory. Something ancient enough that its field memory would be strong, would carry, as he put it, the resonant signature of significant events. He found it in a cavern system in the mountains east of his city, a site that had been known to locals for generations as a place to avoid. Ruins, something older than the civilization that predated his own, stones with carvings he couldn't read, and in the deepest chamber, a column of mineral formation natural, but geometrically perfect in a way that nothing natural has a right to be, that was emitting a measurable resonance. He measured it, he recorded it, he spent 3 days in that cavern with his instruments. On the 3rd day, the resonance changed. "Changed how?" I asked. "It became a signal," he said, "directed, coherent. As if something in the stone had been dormant and my presence, my repeated measurement, my own field had activated it." "Like a receiver," I said. "Like a conversation," he corrected. "Something very old decided I was worth talking to." What happened next, he described in careful, precise language that I suspect was the result of 2.5 centuries of finding ways to explain the inexplicable to the rare person who deserved an explanation. The resonance field of the stone had bonded with his own biological field. His body's electromagnetic profile, the measurable, real energy field that all living organisms produce, had been entangled, at the quantum level, with the resonance of a structure that was thousands of years old and carried within it the accumulated field memory of something he still could not fully characterize. The immediate physical effect: he stopped aging. The secondary effect, which took decades to fully manifest: he became what he was now, which was not, he was careful to specify, what popular culture described as a vampire. He did not require blood to survive. He was not harmed by sunlight. He did not transform into animals or turn into mist. What he was this: a biological entity whose field resonance was so strongly bonded to the ancient stone structure that his continued existence required proximity to it. He could not move more than a certain radius from the site. But the stone had been removed by a collector in the late 18th century, shipped to the Americas, sold, resold, eventually ending up in a private collection that had been donated to an institution. The institution was in this city. The stone was in the sub-basement of this building. Wait, I said, the stone is here in Halcyon. Sub-basement B. It's listed in the archival inventory as a lithic sample collection, designation A7 through A31. The collection was donated to Halcyon's predecessor institution in 1887. And that's why you can't leave, why you've been here for 139 years, yes. Give or take the time before Halcyon took custody of the collection, when I was in a different part of the city. I sat with this for a moment. The spectral signal, I said, the waveform, that's you. My biological field resonance. Yes, it emits constantly. The frequency has been measurable with sensitive enough equipment since the mid-20th century. The Halcyon Research Program was established in part to study it, and in part to contain the information about it. The 16th floor. The 16th floor. And Dr. Reyes. Dr. Reyes has known about me for 12 years. He is one of 8 people currently cleared to know. He's also, he added, with something that might have been dry humor, a very good researcher, even if his data compression presentations leave something to be desired. You were at the meeting yesterday, I said. I was in the building yesterday, yes. I'm usually in the building during daylight hours. The cursed existence is not as dramatic as the stories suggest. I have a functional life within the radius. I read. I conduct research. I occasionally sit through all-hands meetings when the agenda is relevant. You were watching me at the meeting, I said. It wasn't a question. He paused. I was aware of you, he said after a moment. The way that the data flag was worded, the precision of it, the specificity of what you identified, suggested someone who actually understood the data they were processing. That is not common. And on the roof of the parking structure, I said, the night before, that was you. Another pause, longer. Yes, he said. Why? Because your flag came through at 12:43 a.m. and I was already in the building. I'm often in the building late and I saw it, and I went to the window and you were at yours. And you just stood there, watching. I was trying to decide something, he said. Whether to introduce yourself, whether to let you stay involved with this data, whether to have Reyes reassign your file access, whether it was worth, he stopped, whether it was worth the complication. Having me know. Having you involved. I looked at him across the work surface with its screens and its 130-year-old spectral waveforms, and I said, very carefully, what made you decide? He met my eyes. The color of them in this light was more green than gray. You identified the 47-unit periodicity, he said. In 11 years, no data analyst has identified that. It's the specific resonance frequency of the stone. If you can see that in raw data, he stopped again. There are aspects of this research that have been stalled for decades because I have no one capable of processing the information at the level it requires. And you think I can? I think it's possible, he said. That's a very careful way of saying yes. Something that was definitely closer to a smile this time, still controlled, still that face, but there. I have been careful for a very long time, he said. I find it difficult to stop. I texted Priya at 10:15, still here. Fine. This is the most insane thing that has ever happened to me. She replied instantly, what is happening? I texted, I'll explain Saturday, maybe. I'm not sure language is adequate. She sent back 7 question marks and then, if you die I'm pudding, she really should have texted more on your tombstone. I put my phone away and went back to work. The research begins. We worked until 3 in the morning. I say we, and I want to be clear about what that means because it was the 2 of us in a room, yes, but it wasn't collaborative in the warm, collegial way that word implies. It was more like 2 people running parallel processes that happened to intersect. He would show me data. I would process its structure, identify patterns, flag anomalies. He would take my flags and overlay them against the historical record. We would both look at the result. Neither of us said much beyond what was necessary. It was the most interesting work I have ever done. The spectral data from his biological field, 2.5 centuries of it, in increasingly sophisticated measurement formats as the instruments got better, told a story that I was only beginning to understand the edges of. The resonance wasn't static. It changed. Not dramatically, not in ways that would show up in a casual review, but measurably over time. There were periods of intensification and periods of quiet, peaks and valleys. What drives the changes? I asked around midnight. External resonance fields, he said. The stone responds to activity in the broader electromagnetic environment, astronomical events, geomagnetic fluctuations. And he paused. Technological development. The introduction of radio communication in the early 20th century produced a significant intensification. The proliferation of digital networks in the 90s produced another. The waveform is responding to human technological progress. The stone's waveform is interacting with human technological emissions. My field amplifies it. Yes. I looked at the graph that showed the intensification peaks mapped against major technological milestones. It's accelerating, I said. Yes. The most recent intensification, the readings from last night, this is the highest amplitude on record. Yes. I looked up. What does that mean for you, for the field? What happens if it keeps increasing? He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that I knew the answer was not simple and was not good. The bond between the stone and my field was created by a resonance that achieved a threshold, he said. A specific amplitude at which the 2 systems became entangled. If the ambient resonance continues to increase, if the global electromagnetic environment continues to evolve, it could reach the threshold again, I said. From the other direction, he said, entanglement can be broken as well as created. I took this in. And if the entanglement breaks? I don't know, he said. I have been alive for 278 years. Whatever I was before the bond was created, that person died in a cave in 1773. I am the result of the entanglement. If it dissolves, I don't know what remains. He said this with the same careful precision he used for everything. But I heard, underneath it, something that was not quite calm. Something that had lived with this uncertainty for a very long time and had gotten very good at not showing it. Then we need to understand the mechanism, I said. Well enough to predict the trajectory. Well enough to know if there's a threshold to be concerned about and when. He looked at me. Yes, he said, that's exactly right. So, I pulled my chair closer to the work surface. Show me the bond frequency data, the specific 47-unit signature, all of it. We worked until 3. The curse explained, a scientific interlude. Over the following 2 weeks, I learned more about what Dorian Vane was than he had told anyone in a very long time. I want to try to explain it accurately because the story makes less sense without the science, and the science was, once I understood it, genuinely extraordinary. Not magic, not mysticism, something that existed right at the edge of what current physics could describe, which is a different and more interesting thing. The stone in Subbasement B was, by isotopic analysis and resonance profiling, approximately 11,000 years old. It was not naturally occurring in the way of most rock formations. Its mineral composition suggested synthesis under conditions that did not exist in its geographic origin region. Someone made it. Someone with a knowledge of field resonance and crystalline structure that would not be replicated on Earth for roughly 10 millennia. The field it emitted, the resonance that Dorian had stumbled into in 1773, was not random. It had structure. It had the 47-unit periodicity I had identified in the data, which turned out to be a carrier frequency, a base tone on which more complex information was encoded. And the information encoded in it was, in the simplest possible description, a set of instructions. Not instructions for machines, instructions for biology. Specifically, instructions for the biological systems of an organism that was sufficiently sensitive, sufficiently tuned to receive them. Dorian had been that organism. The instructions had rewritten his biological field. Not his genetics, not his cellular chemistry, those remained essentially human. But his field, the electromagnetic and quantum-level information structure that exists in and around every living body and which mainstream science was only beginning to study seriously, had been entangled with the stone's carrier frequency. The practical results: he didn't age. His cells continued their normal processes, but at a rate that, across 278 years, showed negligible net entropy. His body repaired itself with an efficiency that exceeded normal human biological capacity. His senses, specifically his electromagnetic sensitivity, were dramatically enhanced. He could perceive field resonance in his environment, the way most people perceive temperature or sound. The limitation, the entanglement required proximity. The bond was not strong enough to persist across large distances. Within a radius of approximately 3.7 miles from the stone, his field remained stable. Beyond it, the resonance degraded. If he stayed beyond the radius for more than approximately 72 hours, the degradation became irreversible. He had tested this once. In 1891, he had traveled 12 miles from the stone to attend a scientific conference, because he still moved in scientific circles under various identities and had been corresponding with a researcher there whose work he found genuinely extraordinary. He made it to the conference. He attended 2 sessions. And then, at the end of the second day, he had felt something. He described it as the opposite of breathing, a kind of collapse inward. And he had understood what was happening, and he had returned to the city at a pace that was probably alarming to anyone who saw him on the road. He had never left the radius again. "Does it hurt?" I asked when he told me this. "The limitation, does it?" "It's not painful," he said. "It's more like clarity. The closer I am to the stone, the clearer I feel. The further I move, the more it becomes like trying to think through fog. The thinking is still possible, but it costs more. And you've been within 3.7 miles for 139 years. Yes. What's beyond the radius that you've missed most?" He considered this with the seriousness he brought to everything. "Mountains," he said finally. "There are no mountains within the radius. I read accounts of them. I've seen photographs, but I haven't stood in them in," he calculated briefly, 246 years. I didn't say anything. There's no response to that that isn't inadequate. What the data revealed. In week 3, I found something in the historical records that changed everything. I was working alone. Dorian had a habit of disappearing for portions of the night. which I had accepted without asking about, partly because I sensed the reason was complex, and partly because I was deeply absorbed in the data and didn't particularly notice his absence until I surfaced from a particularly intense stretch of analysis and realized the room was quiet and it was 1:30 a.m. The record I found was from 1943, a partial data set. The instruments of the era were crude enough that the readings were noisy, full of artifacts, barely legible. But in the cleaned version that Halcyon's computational team had produced in the 1980s, there was something I recognized. The 47-unit periodicity was there, stable as it had been across the entire historical record. But in the winter of 1943, over a period of approximately 6 weeks, there was a second signal layered within it, faint, inconsistent, but there. A different 47-unit signal, not the carrier from the stone, a response. Something had answered the stone's resonance. I was still staring at this when Dorian returned. I don't know what time it was. He appeared in the room and I turned and said, without preamble, "There's a response signal in the 1943 records." He went still in the way he did when something surprised him, which was visibly different from his ordinary stillness, because his ordinary stillness was controlled, and this was involuntary. Like his body was processing something faster than his mind could manage. "Show me," he said. I showed him. He studied the clean data for a very long time. Then he said, very quietly, "I know what this is." "What?" He looked up. Those gray-green eyes were doing the thing they did when he was deciding how much to say, which I had started to recognize as a particular kind of cognitive tension, information management, in a person who had spent centuries being very careful about what he revealed to whom. "There is a research program," he said, "that Halcyon is not aware of. That predates Halcyon. That predates most of what exists now." He paused. In 1943, one of the researchers involved made contact with this site. What you're seeing is the resonance exchange that occurred. Researchers, you mean people who knew about the stone? About you. People who knew about the stone, he said carefully. About me less clearly. Who are they? He sat down. This was unusual enough that I noticed it. He generally remained standing, which I had started to assume was a habit or a preference. Sitting made him look, in some indefinable way, more tired. "They're called the Meridian Assembly," he said. "They've existed under various names for approximately 300 years. Their original purpose was the study and documentation of sites like the one where I encountered the stone, ancient resonance structures, field-emitting formations, the kind that conventional archaeology classifies as ritual sites or natural wonders and leaves at that." "How many sites are there?" "Documented by the Assembly." 47. I registered the number. 47, same as the carrier frequency. "Yes, that's not a coincidence. The sites are distributed across the planet in a geometric pattern that I spent decades mapping before I understood what I was looking at." He pulled up a display on the secondary screen, a world map dotted with locations. "They form a network, a resonance network. Each site emits at the same carrier frequency with individual modulations. They're in communication." "In communication," I said, "with each other. And possibly with something else." He said this carefully, very carefully, in the way of someone who has been considering whether to say a thing for a very long time. "The pattern of the global network, when mapped geometrically, the angles, the distances, the resonance interference where the fields overlap, it has structure. The kind that doesn't arise from geological processes or human construction, but that is theoretically consistent with." He stopped. "With what?" I said. "With an intended recipient, a structure large enough to receive a 47-site resonance network and process the combined signal." He met my eyes. "Something in orbit, possibly, or something that passes through this region of space on a very long cycle. I've been trying to determine the mathematics of it for decades, but I've been limited by working alone, by the constraints of this radius, by the quality of the data available. I looked at the world map. The 47 dots, the lines connecting them. The 1943 response, I said, was that. I believe it was a test. The assembly made contact with this site to see if the network was still active, if the stone was still resonating, if he paused, if I was still here. Were they the ones who set up the Halcyon research program? They were the ones who arranged for the stone to be here, yes. Who arranged for the institution that became Halcyon to take custody of it. The research program is, at its core, their infrastructure. A way of maintaining scientific documentation of the resonance without explaining its real significance. And Dr. Reyes knows that the stone is extraordinary and scientifically significant, does not know about the network, does not know about the assembly, does not know, he paused, most of what I've told you. I took this in. Why are you telling me? I asked. If Reyes doesn't know, if the 8 people cleared for the 16th floor don't know, why are you telling me? He looked at me across the map of the world, with its 47 lit points. Because the signal is intensifying, he said. I told you the amplitude was at its highest recorded level. What I didn't tell you, what I've been calculating while you were working, is that the rate of intensification has changed. It's not linear anymore. It's exponential. How long until it reaches the threshold? I asked. He was quiet for a moment. At current rates, he said. Approximately 8 months. The wait of 8 months. 8 months. I drove home that night. It was well past 3 in the morning again, and I sat in my car outside my apartment building for about 20 minutes and tried to organize what I was holding. A man, no, an entity. A person who was also something more than a person, who had been alive for 278 years, who was bound by a resonance field to a stone in the subbasement of my workplace, who existed within a 3.7-mile radius he had not left in 139 years, who had spent decades alone trying to understand a planetary network of ancient signal sources that might be attempting to communicate with something in space. This person had told me that the signal was accelerating, that the bond between him and the stone might break within 8 months, and that if it did, he didn't know what would happen to him. And he had told me because I was the only person in 11 years who had identified the 47-unit periodicity in raw data, and because he needed someone who could process the information at the level it required, and because I was fairly sure of this, even if he hadn't said it directly, because he had watched me working at my window at midnight, and something about that had made him decide I was worth trusting. I thought about what Priya had said on the phone. Is he human? He was human. He had been born human, had grown up human, had been educated and curious and alive in the fully human sense for 23 years before the stone changed him. He remembered that person. I could hear him remembering, sometimes in the pauses, the careful, measured quality of the pauses that said he was accessing something old and specific. He was also not entirely human anymore, or not only human. He was human plus something that had no name, yet in any vocabulary I knew. I thought about the mountains he hadn't seen in 246 years. I went upstairs. I fed my monstera. I lay in the dark for an hour without sleeping, and then I made a decision that I realized, actually made the moment I said, okay, start from the beginning. I was going to help him. Not just process the data, actually help. Bring everything I had 4.5 years of pattern recognition, all the lateral thinking instincts I developed processing strange data alone in an empty building at midnight, everything, and put it toward this problem. Because whatever else was true about the situation I had stumbled into, the science was real, the resonance was real, the network was real. And somewhere at the intersection of all of it, was something that had never been properly understood, and understanding it might mean the difference between a person who had survived 278 years continuing to survive, or dissolving into something none of us could predict. I was a data management analyst who was very good at finding patterns. There was a pattern here that needed finding. I texted Priya at 4 a.m. I need to cancel Saturday. She replied 17 minutes later because Priya sleeps lightly. Why? I texted, I'm in the middle of something important, something I can't explain yet. She replied, is this about the mysterious building man? I texted, yes. She replied, Nora. I texted, I know. She replied, are you safe? I thought about it honestly. The stone in the basement, the man who had been alive since 1748, the planetary resonance network pointing at something in the sky. I texted, I think so. I'll explain everything eventually. Please don't worry. She sent back, I'm definitely going to worry. That's literally what I do. I sent a heart emoji. Then I put my phone down, and for the first time in I couldn't remember how long, I fell asleep immediately. Part 1 extended. The assembly makes contact. 3 days after the conversation about the 8-month threshold, a woman arrived at Halcyon. She did not go through the main lobby. I know this because I was in the main lobby at the time, getting a coffee from the cart near the entrance, something I did maybe twice a week, and I did not see her arrive. She was simply there, suddenly, on the 14th floor when I returned from the lobby, standing outside my office door with the look of a person who has been waiting for exactly the amount of time she expected to wait. She was perhaps 50, or perhaps more, and looked 50, in the way that some people carry their age very well and some people don't carry it at all. Dark skin, close-cropped silver hair, a suit that was expensive in a way that was functional rather than decorative. She carried a case, the kind of case that looks like a briefcase but is thicker, with custom latches, the kind you see scientists use for sensitive equipment. She said, Ms. Vasquez, my name is Dr. Odette Camara. I'm with the Meridian Assembly. I need 5 minutes of your time. I said, you can have my office. She sat across my desk, where Dorian had sat 4 days ago. She set the case on the desk but didn't open it. You've been meeting with the entity, she said. Not Mr. Vane, not the researcher, the entity, with a specificity and a comfort with the word that told me she had been using it for a long time. His name is Dorian, I said, because it felt important to establish that. She gave me a look that was not unkind but was very direct. He's told you about the network. Some of it. And about the threshold. Yes. Then I'll skip the preliminaries. She opened the case. Inside were what looked like sensor arrays, small, modular, extraordinarily precise, and a device I didn't recognize that was clearly both a measurement tool and a communications interface. The assembly has been monitoring the signal intensification for the past 8 years. We have records going back much further than Halcyon's, and our modeling is considerably more detailed. She placed a display screen on the desk, brought up a graph. It was the same exponential curve Dorian had shown me, but more precisely charted, with confidence intervals and projected trajectories. 8 months, I said. 6, she corrected. Our latest model puts the threshold breach at approximately 6 months. We've been conservative in what we told, she paused, in what the entity was told. We weren't sure he needed to know the precise timing until we had assets in place. Assets, I said, you mean me? We mean a data analyst who could identify the 47-unit periodicity in raw output. Yes. She looked at me with the directness again. You understand what that means, that you identified it. That I'm sensitive to the carrier frequency. More than sensitive. She tapped the sensor array in the case. Your biological field resonates at the 47-unit frequency. We've been looking for someone like you for 20 years. You are what the assembly calls a convergent receiver. I sat with this. A convergent receiver, I said. Someone whose own electromagnetic profile is naturally tuned to the carrier frequency of the resonance network. It's extremely rare. Perhaps one in several million, and it means she paused. It means you can do something Dorian Vane cannot. You can perceive the network signal without the bond, without the stone. You're not limited to the radius. What does that mean practically, I said, for the threshold problem? The bond can be stabilized, she said. Theoretically, if the carrier frequency can be reinforced externally, if the stone's resonance is augmented by an external source at the right periodicity, the exponential growth of the ambient signal can be counteracted. The threshold can be pushed back or avoided entirely. And the external source needs to be a convergent receiver, she said. Someone who can generate the frequency naturally rather than through technology. Technology introduces interference at the quantum level. We've tried it with instruments, and the interference actually accelerates the degradation rather than slowing it. She looked at me with those precise, experienced eyes. The stone needs a person, she said, a specific kind of person, and you are the first convergent receiver we've identified in 20 years of searching. The complication. I need to stop here and tell you something. Because up to this point, this is a story about data and science, and a man who has been alive for centuries and a woman who processes files for a living. And those things are all true, and they're all the framework, but they're not the story exactly. The story is about what happens when you spend 3 weeks working until 3 a.m. in a room with someone who is unlike anyone you've ever met, and you start to notice things. Not just the information he provides, not just the data and the network and the threshold and the 8 months that are now apparently 6, but the way he moves through a room with that deliberate, unhurried precision that I had thought at first was arrogance but had come to understand was something closer to the opposite. A person who moves carefully because he has learned, over 278 years, the cost of carelessness. The way he talks about the mountains. The way he sometimes looks out the north windows at the city, and his face does that thing, the control slipping, just fractionally, just for a second, and I catch it and pretend I don't, because I understand that it would cost him something to be caught. The way he said I have been careful for a very long time, and the way that sentence carried, underneath it, everything he'd had to be careful about, every person he'd watched age and die, every version of the world he'd watched change, every morning he'd woken up in a 3.7-mile radius knowing he couldn't leave it. I was falling for him. There I said it. I was falling for a man who had been alive since before the American Revolution, who might dissolve into quantum nothing in 6 months if we couldn't solve a century-old resonance problem, and who was, by my best assessment, approximately as likely to fall for me as he was to spontaneously develop the ability to leave the radius. But I was also a data analyst who was good at her job. So I told Dr. Kamara, what do I need to do? The protocol. Dr. Kamara spent 4 hours in my office, explaining what the Meridian Assembly had developed over the past 20 years. The protocol, as she called it, was in principle simple. A convergent receiver, operating in close proximity to the stone, could act as a resonance amplifier. Their natural field frequency would interact with the stone's carrier signal, and if the interaction was correctly managed, would reinforce the 47-unit periodicity at a strength sufficient to counteract the environmental intensification. In practice, she described it as, I would need to spend time near the stone, regularly, in sessions of sufficient duration that my field could synchronize with the stone's resonance and maintain that synchronization. The duration of each session and the frequency of sessions would depend on measurements of my specific field profile. And for Dorian, I said, what does this mean for him? She was quiet for a moment. The stabilization affects the bond between the stone and his field, she said. Your amplification of the carrier would strengthen the bond rather than allowing the ambient intensification to overwhelm it. That's the good version, I said, because I could hear that there was another version. The complication, she said carefully, is that a convergent receiver who synchronizes with the stone's frequency will also entangle at the field level with the bond, with the entity's field. It's not possible to reinforce his bond without also forming a partial bond of your own. I let that sit. How partial, I said. Unknown. The assembly has never had a convergent receiver in the field long enough to determine the upper limit of synchronization. Is it reversible? To an extent. Probably. The assembly's models suggest that a partial bond formed by proximity rather than direct entanglement, as his was, would be significantly weaker and potentially dissoluble if the receiver moves sufficiently far from the stone for a sufficient period. But the radius, I said, if I formed any kind of bond, even partial, would I have the same radius restriction he has? Not at first, she said. The partial bond develops gradually. In the early stages, you would experience no limitation. Over time, months, possibly years, the restriction would develop. She said this with the careful tone of someone delivering information they know is going to complicate everything. I was quiet for a moment. So to help him, I said, to stop the threshold from breaking his bond with the stone, I have to form my own bond with it, one that will eventually restrict me the same way he's restricted. Possibly, she said, in the most extended scenario, if synchronization were allowed to progress without interruption. But there are protocols for managing the synchronization, limiting it, maintaining a partial state without allowing it to develop fully. We believe, based on the theory, and we have never tested this, that a convergent receiver could maintain a stable partial bond indefinitely without progressing to a full restriction if the synchronization sessions are properly managed. You believe. We believe. I looked at her. You're asking me to potentially limit my own life to a 3.7-mile radius, I said, to fix a problem that's been developing for 278 years. For a man I met 3 weeks ago. She met my eyes. Ms. Vasquez, she said, I'm asking you to consider it. No one is asking you to decide today. I know, I said. I looked out my window. The parking structure across the street. The roof where he had stood 2 weeks ago, watching me, deciding whether I was worth the complication. I need to talk to him, I said. The conversation. I found him in the east stairwell at 11 p.m. He was standing on the landing between the 12th and 13th floors, leaning against the wall, which was the closest thing to casual I had ever seen him look. He was reading something on a tablet, and he looked up when the door opened, and his expression did the thing I'd started to call the recalibration, where he assessed the situation and adjusted, very slightly, whatever he'd been feeling before you arrived. Dr. Kamara told you, he said. She did. I should have told you first, he said. I knew she was coming, I should have. It's fine, I said. I need to ask you something. He waited. In 278 years, I said. Has anyone ever offered to do this before? He was very still. No, he said after a moment. The assembly has been searching for a convergent receiver for 20 years. Before that, we didn't know such a person was necessary. We thought a technological solution was possible. And if I say no, if I don't synchronize with the stone, then the threshold will break in 6 months, he said, and what happens to me is uncertain. And if I say yes, then the threshold doesn't break, he said. The bond is stabilized, and he paused, and you take on a limitation you've done nothing to deserve on behalf of someone you met 3 weeks ago. Or I take on something genuinely extraordinary, I said, On behalf of someone whose work I find genuinely important, whose company I find genuinely, I stopped, chose a word, worth something. He looked at me. In 11 years, Dr. Kamara had said, nobody had identified the 47-unit periodicity. In 278 years, nobody had offered to help. I watched him hold these two things simultaneously, this precise, careful, unhurried man, and I watched something shift in the architecture of his expression. "Nora," he said. "Don't," I said. "Don't do the careful thing. Don't manage the information. Just tell me what you actually think." A long pause. "I think," he said slowly, "that I have spent 278 years being very careful not to let anyone become important to me. Because everyone I've let become important has aged and died, and I haven't, and the accumulated weight of that," he stopped. "The accumulated weight of that is something I learned to protect myself from." "But," I said, because there was clearly a but. "But you noticed a waveform pattern that no one noticed for 11 years, and your first response to being told I was a cursed entity was to ask for the data and start from the beginning. And you have," he paused, "11 plants in your apartment, one of which you've apparently had since graduate school." "Gerald," I said. "Gerald," he confirmed, with what might have been the ghost of something warm in his voice. "And I watched you work for 3 weeks and I couldn't make myself maintain the appropriate distance, which is, for me, extremely unusual." "It's unusual for me too," I said. "I know," he said, "I know it is." We stood in the stairwell between the 12th and 13th floors for a while without saying anything, not uncomfortably, just present. "I'm going to synchronize with the stone," I said eventually. "Not today. We need to do the baseline field measurements first, and I need to understand the protocol properly, but I'm going to do it." He looked at me with those gray-green eyes and said, very quietly, "You should know that this decision is not reversible in any simple sense. Even if the partial bond doesn't develop fully, even if you leave the radius before it progresses, what you've done here, what you've seen, who you've met." "I know," I said. "I'm not going to pretend I don't want you to say yes," he said. "That would be the careful version of this conversation. I'm trying, as you suggested, not to do the careful thing." "Good," I said. "Then yes," he said, "to everything you're not quite saying yet." "Yes." I took a breath. "Okay," I said. "Okay," he said. We went upstairs and started the baseline measurements. The synchronization. The first session with the stone was anticlimactic. I had prepared myself intellectually for something dramatic, flashing lights, a physical sensation, something that would announce itself clearly as the moment when the ordinary became otherwise. Sub-basement B was a long, low-ceilinged room full of shelving units. The stone collection, designation A7 through A31, as Dorian had said, occupied a section of shelving along the eastern wall. The stones were labeled with small tags, each one in a sealed archival case. They looked, to the uninformed eye, like a geology department's teaching collection. Dull. Institutional. Dorian led me to the section. He stopped in front of one of the cases. A19, the label said. Inside was a stone approximately the size of a large grapefruit, irregular in shape, dark in color, with a crystalline surface that caught the overhead light and scattered it in patterns that seemed to have more directions than light normally goes. He opened the case, set the stone on the work surface Dr. Kamara had set up next to the shelving, a sensor array on each side, a monitoring station, a recording system. "Just stand near it," Dr. Kamara said. "For now, that's all." I stood near it. And the thing I felt was quiet, not sound quiet, internal quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when something that has been making background noise for so long you've stopped hearing it suddenly stops. Like a machine you didn't know was running. I hadn't known my own field was making noise until the noise settled. Your readings are remarkable, Dr. Kamara said, watching the sensor output. The synchronization is happening much faster than the models predicted, much faster than. She glanced at Dorian. Your entanglement took 3 days of exposure, yes. 3 days of continuous proximity, he said. Yes. Her initial synchronization response is stronger than your full entanglement at the end of day 3. She said this with the calm of a scientist for whom extraordinary results are always primarily data. Ms. Vasquez, what do you feel? Quiet, I said, settled, like something clicked into place. The frequency match is within 0.04%, she said. That's not measurable by any instrument we have. That's essentially exact. Dorian said nothing, but I could feel, and I mean that in a new way, in a way I hadn't been able to feel anything before I walked into this room. I could feel his attention on me. Not invasive, not uncomfortable, like a field matching a field. The stone surface shifted, slightly, in the way it scattered light. Dr. Kamara made a sound. The stone's output has changed, she said. The amplitude has increased by 12% in the last 30 seconds. That's the wrong direction, I said. We want to reduce the ambient. No, Dorian said. You misunderstand. The ambient signal is the external intensification, the environmental resonance from global technology expansion. The stone's own output, its carrier frequency, is separate, and it has been decreasing for decades, 40 years of slow attrition. He was looking at the readings. 12% in 30 seconds is. He stopped. It's answering you, Dr. Kamara said quietly. The stone's crystalline surface scattered the light in a new pattern. I stood in a sub-basement in November and felt something 11,000 years old say hello. The network responds. The following 3 months were the most extraordinary and exhausting, and occasionally terrifying months of my life. I will try to be honest about all of it. The synchronization sessions increased from once a week to 3 times a week, because the stone's carrier frequency was recovering at a rate that required sustained reinforcement. My field profile measurements, which Dr. Kamara conducted at each session, were tracked obsessively. The partial bond was developing. I could feel it, a kind of background awareness that I couldn't turn off, a low-level attunement to the stone and to Dorian's field that was present even when I was at home, even when I was watering Gerald at 8 a.m. It was not unpleasant. That's what surprised me most. It wasn't intrusive or frightening or uncomfortable. It was like adding a sense I hadn't known was missing, an additional layer of perception. But it was also, as Dr. Kamara had warned, developing. By month 2, I could feel the edge of the radius. Not physically, I didn't become ill when I crossed it, wasn't affected in any dramatic way. But there was a quality to the air beyond it, a kind of thinning that I hadn't noticed before and now couldn't ignore. The way the quietness in my field became less quiet when I was too far from the stone. I started planning my routes, grocery stores within the radius, my gym, which was just inside it, my apartment, which was 2.4 miles from the building, comfortably within. I didn't tell Priya about the radius. I told her about Dorian. Not everything, not the 278 years, not the stone, not the technical details, but the shape of it, that I was involved with someone from work, someone complicated, someone worth the complications. She came to meet me for coffee on a Saturday in month 2, at a place on the edge of the Innovation District, and she looked at me across the table for a long moment and said, "You look different." "Different how?" "Settled," she said, like something clicked into place. I thought about the sub-basement, the stone, the quiet. "Yeah," I said, "something did." In month 3, the network responded. I should explain what that means, because up until this point the network had been a theoretical construct. 47 sites that emitted the same carrier frequency. A geometric pattern suggestive of an intended recipient. Decades of mathematical modeling and spectral analysis pointing at something, but never quite reaching it. I was running a synchronization session on a Tuesday evening, alone, which I did sometimes now. The protocol well enough established that Dr. Kamara didn't need to supervise every session, when the stone's output changed in a way I hadn't experienced before. The carrier frequency shifted, by a small amount, an amount that would have been lost in the noise of any instrument less sensitive than the array we'd set up. But I could feel it directly, the way you can feel a change in temperature before any thermometer would register it. The shift was directional. The frequency was leaning somehow, oriented. I checked the sensor array. The data was confirming what I was feeling. And it wasn't just this stone. The array was picking up sympathetic resonances from the global monitoring network that the assembly maintained. 47 sites worldwide. All shifting simultaneously, all orienting in the same direction. I called Dorian. He was there in 4 minutes, which tells you something about how the last 3 months had changed things between us, and he looked at the data, and he was very still in the involuntary way. Nor-northwest, he said. What? The orientation vector, it's nor-northwest. He pulled up the global network map. The 47 sites were shown as dots, and now there were lines extending from each orientation vectors, angles of field lean captured by the monitoring network. They weren't parallel, they were converging. They converged on a point in the sky. Calculate the declination, he said, typing rapidly. Adjust for date, time, latitude. The point in the sky resolved to a location. That's in the inner solar system, I said, looking at the ephemeris data on the secondary screen. That's between Earth and Mars. Yes, he said. There's nothing there. Not yet, he said. He turned to me. His eyes were, in that moment, doing something I hadn't seen before, which was holding, simultaneously, 278 years of waiting and the immediate present, at the same time, with equal weight. Something is incoming, he said. The network is receiving it. This is what it was built for. What is it? I said. I don't know, he said, but I think he paused. I think whatever set this network in motion, 11,000 years ago, is coming back to check on it.